In the spring of 1349, a London tanner named Thomas of Woodstock walked into his workshop on a Tuesday morning, noticed a swelling the size of an egg under his left arm, and was dead by Thursday. His neighbors stripped the body, sold his tools, and were back at work by Friday. And the thing that should genuinely disturb you about that story is not the speed of his death. It's that nobody wrote it down as unusual. Nobody mourned publicly. Nobody stopped. Because in 1349, that was just a Tuesday in London. 1 in 3 people in Europe would be dead within 4 years. In some cities, it was closer to 1 in 2. You would not have survived any of this. And over the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly why. Let me take you inside the city first, because the physical reality of London in 1348 is something no modern comparison quite captures, though we can try. Roughly 70,000 people lived inside a walled city of approximately 1 square mile, giving it a population density comparable to modern Manhattan. Manhattan, of course, has sewers. London had the Thames, which served simultaneously as the city's primary water source, its primary waste disposal system, and, for the optimistic, its primary fishing ground. The river was not a metaphor for London's sanitation problem. It was the sanitation problem. The streets themselves had names that tell you everything you need to know. Sherborne Lane was recorded in medieval documents as Shitbrook Lane. That is not slang. That is a cartographic description. Open channels called kennels ran down the center of most streets, carrying a mixture of animal waste, human waste, butcher's offal, and whatever the tanners, men like Thomas, had discharged from their workshops that morning. The smell would have reached you before the city did. Contemporary chronicler William Langland described London's air as something that thickened the throat and sat behind the eyes. He meant that as observation, not complaint. That was just what cities smelled like. You would have been living in a timber-framed house packed tightly against identical timber-framed houses, sharing walls, sharing vermin, sharing the fleas that rode the black rats that colonized every grain store, every stable, and every thatched roof in the city. The rats were not considered a problem. They were considered furniture. Here's the thing about medieval medicine that most people get completely wrong. The popular image of medieval physicians as purely superstitious frauds ignores the fact that they were working from a coherent, internally logical system, a system that simply had nothing to do with how disease actually worked. Galenic humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greece and refined over 1,000 years of serious scholarship, held that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance. Disease was imbalance. The cure was restoration. This meant that when plague arrived, the most educated doctors in Europe reached for bloodletting, purging, and aromatic herbs to correct the corrupted humors they believed were responsible. The physician John of Burgundy, writing in 1365, recommended that patients open their windows to ventilate the corrupt air, then immediately burn juniper and rosemary to replace it with clean air. The logic was perfect. The outcomes were not. Bleeding a patient already dying of septicemia accelerated their death. Purging a patient already in systemic collapse killed them faster. The best medical minds in Europe were, with complete sincerity and rigorous application of everything they knew, making the plague more efficient. And none of that mattered, because you would not have had access to a physician anyway. There were perhaps a handful of trained physicians in all of London. Most people consulted barber surgeons, who were skilled craftsmen, but were working from the same wrong map. Others consulted apothecaries, who sold remedies that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Many consulted nobody, because there was nobody to consult, and died in the rooms where they'd fallen ill, which is where we should talk about what the plague actually did to a body. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, arrived in England in the summer of 1348, carried by fleas on rats aboard merchant ships docking at Melcombe in Dorset. It moved in 3 forms. Bubonic plague, the most common, infected the lymphatic system and produced the characteristic buboes, swellings in the groin, armpit, or neck that could reach the size of an apple, accompanied by fever, hemorrhaging beneath the skin that produced the black patches giving the disease its eventual name, and death in roughly 30 to 75% of untreated cases within a week. Pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and spread through respiratory droplets, was nearly 100% fatal. Septicemic plague, which entered the bloodstream directly, killed so fast that some chroniclers recorded patients going to bed healthy and being found dead in the morning. The monk Henry Knighton, writing from Leicester, described streets so full of the dead that carts moved through them at dawn, collecting bodies the way modern cities collect refuse. He was not being poetic. The historian Ole Benedictau, whose 2004 study remains the most comprehensive demographic analysis of the Black Death, estimated that England lost between 40 and 60% of its total population between 1348 and 1351. In some villages, the number was 80%. In some, there was nobody left to count. Now let me take you inside what happened to the institutions that were supposed to protect you, because this is where the darkest irony in this entire story lives. The church, which was the closest thing medieval Europe had to a public health system, a social safety net, and a psychological support structure simultaneously, was decimated precisely because it tried to do its job. Priests administered last rites. Monks staffed the hospitals. Nuns nursed the sick. They did this because their theology demanded it, and because they were, by any measure, genuinely brave. They died at rates that exceeded the general population. Pope Clement VI, watching from Avignon as his clergy collapsed around him, issued a papal bull in 1348, officially permitting people to confess their sins to a layperson, or, if no layperson was available, even to a woman. That tells you everything you need to know about how desperate the institutional church had become. The civic government of London fared no better. King Edward III wrote a letter to the mayor of London in 1349, ordering him to clean the streets, noting that the city's filth was worsening the pestilence. The mayor issued proclamations. The proclamations were ignored. The people responsible for enforcing them were dying. The people dying had nowhere to go. The fear of contagion, which people understood intuitively even without germ theory, drove families to abandon the sick, drove the sick to wander, and drove wanderers into new towns, carrying the disease with them. The fear of plague made the plague faster. The flagellant movement, which swept through Europe during these years, saw groups of men publicly whipping themselves to atone for the sins they believed had brought divine punishment upon humanity. They moved from city to city in processions of hundreds. They gathered crowds. They spread pneumonic plague to every town they passed through. The penance designed to stop the plague was one of its most efficient vectors. But we haven't even gotten to what you would have eaten. And that's worth staying for. Your diet, if you were a laborer in 1348 London, consisted primarily of coarse bread made from rye or barley, pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables hadn't rotted, and ale, because ale was safer than water, and you knew it. Fresh meat was expensive and infrequent. Preserved meat was salt-heavy and stored in conditions that made spoilage a constant companion. Ergot fungus, which grows on rye in damp conditions and causes hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene of the extremities, contaminated grain stores regularly enough that it had its own name, St. Anthony's Fire. Your bread was occasionally psychoactive, not in a pleasant way. You were already malnourished before the plague arrived. Your immune system was already compromised. You were already sharing your home with the rats and fleas that carried Yersinia pestis. You were drinking from the same river you disposed of your waste into. Your doctor was bleeding you. Your priest was dying. Your city government was writing letters. And somewhere on a merchant ship from the continent, in the fur of a rat in a grain hold, a flea was digesting a blood meal infected with a bacterium that had already killed half of Asia. You would have woken that Tuesday morning and gone to work. You would have drunk your ale and eaten your bread and breathed the thick, familiar air of a city that smelled like what it was. You would have noticed, perhaps, a tenderness under your arm, a swelling, a heat. You would have told yourself it was nothing, because what else do you tell yourself? And by Thursday, it would have been over. And by Friday, someone else would have been using your tool